Warner Brothers and Avalanche spellbound the gaming world with its Harry Potter Hogwarts prequel, starting an avalanche of success for them and the studio. And to maintain that momentum, the staggered releases on last generation consoles landed last week. And to stop you from wondering if the old magic is still there, we go back to school on frame rates, graphics, and those busy times between classes to see if the legacy lives on. In software development, 3 months can be a lifetime, and that is the gap Avalanche had to refine, condense, and optimize its hugely successful and very impressive Harry Potter-inspired RPG adventure. Cramming such a rich, varied, and sprawling game into 10-year-old hardware and mechanical drives is no small feat. It's all here though, with nothing left out, although some cuts are required and obvious. Resolution, fluidity, fidelity are highlights, but the biggest is the loading and streaming. The impacts can be bigger on some platforms than others, with it never being consistent on what and which is better. Surprisingly, all versions support an unlocked frame rate, which I applaud, but no other modes are present. You can turn off motion blur, chromatic aberration, film grain, and depth of field if desired, but nothing more, which is a relief from the 5 modes on the Series X and PlayStation 5. Testing the day one disc code, you can't get past the introduction section, meaning you have to download the latest patches to be able to play the game in full, and that is where you get the option to unlock the frame rate. Prior to this, all versions run with an unlocked frame rate anyway. From a visuals and presentation perspective, it's certainly everything the now generation versions are, just with nips and tucks in the right places. It still runs using the same Unreal Engine 4 that powered the now generation versions, meaning it still runs with the same effects such as real-time cinematics predominantly mixed with video files at certain points. It has reductions in all the right places, volumetric clouds are still present, but obviously the lower resolution can affect those. Texture detail, assets, and streaming are all big changes you'll see due to the fact that the game was designed around the much faster CPU memory subsystems and SSDs in the current generation of consoles, which can impact some of these older generation consoles, certainly in the Xbox One, which can struggle the most when it comes to data streaming. The whole game is data driven, which can cause some strange issues and certainly some visual artifacts once you play on these last generation versions, but fundamentally there's not a huge difference here aside the clarity and detail, which scales further up the stack the closer you get to the Xbox One X. So let's start at the top and work our way down. The Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro get the closest to achieving current generation levels. In the Xbox One X's case, they can even exceed some in the Series S. Achieving current gen levels, the Xbox One X comes in at the top, with counts at 2560 by 1440 fixed from all my counts anyway, and that seems to be joined with FSR 1 upscaling back to 4K. It offers a sharper and more defined image than the Series S in its fidelity mode, which only runs at a 1080p maximum. The Pro is almost identical here, hitting again a fixed count of 1920 by 1080, meaning image quality and clarity is significantly reduced over the One X, but almost a match with the Series S. Comparing the two last-gen premium machines highlights that aside resolution boost for the One X, it also gains a minor grass increase over the Pro, meaning you get slightly more of the green stuff nearer your avatar. Although many of these effects, including level of detail, can actually be affected by the resolution, so this may be something to do with that. Textures can also run, when fully loaded at least, with a more detailed and better quality over the Pro, due to the big boost in memory it has over that console. All other effects such as shadows, SSR, and screen space shadows are a match aside resolution related impacts. The Pro, like the base PS4, does have one big boost though: shadow casting light sources. In many interiors or man-made lights, the PlayStation platforms include a shadow casting point light emitter which matches all current generation consoles. This is simply not present on the One X or the base Xbox One, and along with heavier reductions in world streaming, point to this being a game running in more of a fallback code path on the One X, which does not cater well for the huge gulf in memory, bandwidth, GPU, and even CPU power. It is hopefully something the team can patch, as the increased resolution, grass draw, and even depth of field show that not all settings are aligned to the Xbox One, so this should be something they can easily fix. I do suspect though that this is a time-saving exercise within the SDK and APIs of the Xbox platform. So next is performance, and here there is a bigger difference than we've seen in the visuals at certain points. Using the unlocked option on all of the consoles here to test the performance headroom we have for a 30 FPS cap, we can see that the PS4 Pro can get close and actually hit 60 FPS at certain points, but the Xbox One X cannot achieve this. It certainly has much higher demands on the hardware in terms of the significant increase in resolution, but overall many of the sections in the title are CPU and GPU bound back and forth, and this is borne out by the tests here, with the PS4 Pro being somewhere around 25% faster than the Xbox One X. It can peak and trough at certain points certainly, but there's not a huge difference between them, and that means that the unlocked mode on the PS4 Pro is the only console of all four tested here that actually makes that option a viable choice to pick, because it can hover somewhere between the 40s and 50s. And in fact, if the console supported VRR, it would probably work perfectly at that range. That said, the Xbox One X can certainly hold above 30 FPS most of the time, but you will have some stutters and judders at certain points in the title, mostly related to asset streaming, texture streaming, and CPU hiccups that can affect the Xbox One platforms more than the PlayStation platforms. Even the PS4 Pro can perform better on these points, with the Xbox One X and the Xbox One having some 400 millisecond spikes at times, with me never seeing anything worse than 120 milliseconds on the PS4 platforms, which shows there is likely some differences in the APIs and SDKs of these two platforms, which is being borne out in the slightly lower level of utilization the Xbox One X sees. That said, the performance levels are certainly good enough for a 30 FPS cap on both consoles to never really be of serious concern, but there will be points in the title, certainly running between classes and going in and out of certain battles, where the performance can dip below 30 FPS for periods of time, and with a title as big as this, there might be some edge cases that even go lower. Overall though, performance is very good on both of these consoles, certainly good enough to never offend most players. So next up, the small and still mighty 10-year-old PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, and the story is a very similar one to what we just covered on the Pro and the Xbox One X. This means that we get similar levels of output and presentation as the PS4 to the Pro and the Xbox One to the Xbox One X, but the biggest differences are resolution related and some effects. As discussed, the Xbox One loses out on those shadow casting light sources on interiors, which can be a big impact at certain points in the title, but the biggest deficit between the two of them is resolution. The PS4 comes in with an approximate 1600 by 900p, again it seems fixed using FSR back to 1080p, and the Xbox One comes in with a 1280 by 720, again appears fixed, rescaling back using FSR 1. The other minor difference is the grass again is slightly reduced on the Xbox One, but that could be down to the resolution deficit. But really, the biggest difference between these two consoles is the texture streaming and data management within the entire engine. The scratch pad of the Xbox One in its SRAM is likely partly the cause here, which can cause long periods of time of low quality textures, which can also affect the Xbox One X. And that also points to the fact, as mentioned, that the Xbox One X seems to struggle with similar issues in memory management and texture streaming, likely down to the deployment pipeline and SDK the team have used here. Now, these issues, slow loading textures, streaming issues, can happen on every single platform, including the PlayStation, but they're certainly less egregious on the PlayStation platforms over the Xbox One, and the SRAM issues really stand out more on the Xbox One as it streams in these tile-based MIPS, as you can see on the screen here, as it's pushing data through that SRAM to get the best quality to screen. That can take upwards of a few frames or even a few seconds at times, constantly as you work through the world. But the biggest technical difference between the last generation and current is something that affects gameplay throughout, and that is loading and streaming. I had points where I could beat the streaming system on the Xbox One and couldn't actually run up the stairs until they loaded in, but also you'll see these little mini loading screens very often in Hogwarts as you run between classes, which can pop up even on the PS5, but they're usually less than a few frames. Here, they can be upwards of 30 seconds at worst. On top of this, fast travel is anything but, and even loading from saves can be around 4 seconds on the PlayStation 5, and here on the absolute worst I could test on the Xbox One X, took over 1.5 minutes. In actual fact, it was slower than the PlayStation 4, and yet yet they're both using a mechanical drive. Again, reinforcing my point around the APIs being used here. Overall though, the game is still there and present, but just expect to be spending far more time in between classes than enjoying them.
Oh, hello there. Welcome to Gryffindor. I'm Cressida.
Pleasure to meet you, Cressida.
And so we move to the performance level of these two consoles, and what we see is worse performance across the board. Anywhere where it's CPU bound, such as in Hogwarts, we will see both the PS4 and the Xbox One spend long periods of time below 30 FPS. But this is largely the worst section of the game on any piece of hardware, including high-end PC. Outside of this, we tend to hover somewhere into the mid-30s on the PlayStation 4 and somewhere around or just below the 30s on the Xbox One. Again, expect the same issues on the Xbox One X, but amplified here on the One, more stuttering, more streaming issues, and generally more judder throughout the game. And overall, the CPU impact on both consoles means that it really has an unlocked option more as a curio than anything you'd actually want to turn on. It does show that at certain points you can run somewhere in the 40s, but that's a standard level of target for many titles that run at a capped 30 FPS. And that would be my recommendation on all four consoles, but certainly the PS4 and the Xbox One, where they are predominantly above or below 30 FPS. Now, it really isn't a bad performing title, but do have expectations in check that you will have performance issues, stutters and hiccups throughout your play, but it still delivers on the magic and the wonder of this Hogwarts Legacy title. Albeit a little slower and softer on the eyeballs, it still makes you feel like Harry Potter, if you want to. Warner Brothers and the team must be commended for taking the 3 months they needed to polish and refine and squeeze this huge title into 10-year-old hardware. And achieve it they have. It may have some issues, rough around the edges, and certainly some performance and graphical glitches that don't appear on the now generation consoles, but ultimately this is everything of Hogwarts Legacy completely condensed into these old generation consoles, and it really misses none of that magic. If you don't have a PlayStation 5 and Series X or even a Series S, then these are still an excellent way to play it. But if you do, going back to these last generation releases certainly gives you slightly better appreciation of just how much the new generation consoles are adding to the visual fidelity and performance. Anyway, that's it for our fast and deep dive into game technology, performance and everything Pixel related. Remember, if you like what we do here on IGN, then keep it IGN Performance Reviews, and we'll catch you on the next one.